while I keep my eyes on the road, even though these cars do drive themselves. Guys, I wanted to talk about Scientology destroying families. Scientology destroyed my family. And this is something that if you've got any friends or family members who are flirting with Scientology in any way, shape, or form, one of the most relatable things that you can say to them for to get them to steer them away from that path is, whoa, wait, you're doing what? Dianetics, Scientology. Didn't you know? Scientology destroys families. Man, Scientology tears apart families. That's like the most obvious thing about Scientology is that it destroys families. And, there's a lot of very objectionable things about Scientology. There's probably a top 10 list of the most destructive things about Scientology. From the fact that they cover up SA, they cover up child SA, they cover up all SA, including child SA. The fact that they train children to become professional Scientology auditors and interrogate adults about wildly age-inappropriate material. The fact that children themselves are subjected to such age-inappropriate interrogations, and age-inappropriate is what I meant to say if I misstated that. The fact that Scientology abuses the elderly, the financial abuse, the fraud. There's so many things, guys. But one of the most obvious and relatable things is that Scientology destroys families. This is something, I want to do a little dedicated chat about it right here because this is something I don't talk about on my channel. You guys might have noticed on my channel I tend to focus on current events. I tend to focus on topical matters. I tend not to talk about my own story that much because honestly, how often and how many times can somebody talk about their own story? Like eventually you're going to run out of things to talk about. It's a little boring. From my perspective, my story is boring. From other people's perspective, I'm sure it's horrendous. And when I go on other people's podcasts, when I went on Lex Friedman, when I went on Jordan Peterson, when I went on Julian Dory, when I went on Matt Cox, of course they end up asking me about my own story. One of the reasons I don't like talking about it is because it's hard to do without getting emotional. And that's not my favorite thing to do. But while I'm a little distracted, while I'm paying attention to the road like a responsible driver, maybe I could do this some brief justice, telling the story on my channel very briefly. Remember, guys, Scientology destroyed L. Ron Hubbard's family. Scientology destroyed Tom Cruise's family. Scientology has destroyed David Miscavige's family. No one is safe from the familial destruction of Scientology. And so in my case, my wife and I got married. My current wife, we're not divorced yet. My wife and I met working in Scientology's Sea Organization. My mom was in Scientology at the time. My younger brother was in Scientology. My mom's husband was in Scientology. My wife's entire family was in Scientology. Her parents, her siblings. Let's see, is the autopilot working here? Yes, autopilot's working. Okay, we meet in the Sea Org. After being married for 4 years in the Sea Org, we leave the Sea Org in 2006. In 2009, our journey out of Scientology begins. We start reading some stuff that's been published in the newspapers. We start reading some stuff that former scientists are putting out there. In 2009, the journey begins. I'm starting to read the blogs. I'm starting to anonymously comment on the blogs. I'm starting to secretly be in touch with some of these people who are writing the blogs. And that was the beginning of the end. And my mom was the first member of the family to be officially kicked out of Scientology. There was a former Sea Org executive named Debbie Cook who had sent out an email to basically all Scientologists in the world saying, David Miscavige is destroying Scientology, don't support him. And that was a message that resonated with a lot of people, my mom included, me included. And my mom had some conversations about that email with some people Scientology didn't want her to have those conversations with. And I'm giving a real short version here, guys. And, when Scientology realized they weren't going to get my mom to change her way of thinking, then they officially kicked her out. So then they come to me and they say, okay, now you've got to never see your mom or talk to your mom again, or you're going to get kicked out. And I thought, I think I can lie about that and get away with it. So that's what I'm going to do. And so I never really did disconnect from my mom. But I told the church that I did, and I even came up with some whole story. I had to go into the org. I had to pick up the cans of the e-meter, and I had to tell them all about the conversation where I disconnected from my mom, and I had to really convince them that this occurred. Like, the stakes were very high. You have to understand, I no longer at this point believed in Scientology, but I was still in the ecosystem of it. I worked for a Scientologist. My wife worked for a Scientologist. Our kids went to a Scientology school. All of our friends were Scientologists. Our friends, their friends are Scientologists. All this kind of stuff. So I was going to be damned if I was going to never see and talk to my mom again for an organization I didn't even really believe in. And so I feel like that went on for about 2 years. And my eyes are red. I feel like that went on for about 2 years. And, I was getting a little careless about how carefully I was keeping this secret from my friends. Because I started, I think everyone maybe has a little bit of this thing where it's easy to assume that other people feel and believe the same way that you feel and believe. And the more I started to drift away from Scientology, the more I started to be convinced that all my friends were probably also secretly drifting away from Scientology, but were too afraid to mention it. And how would I ever know that? I would only know that if I started to drop some little breadcrumbs here and there and see how they responded. That was the wrong thing to do. I mean, strategically speaking, in retrospect, it was not smart, because all it did was show my hand. And so, Scientology is very much a snitching culture. And so some people who were some of my closest friends, and even the nanny of my children, were basically secretly spying on us and reporting on us to Scientology. And Scientology started to get more and more reports of me and my daughters still being in touch with my mom. And, I even went so far as to once they first caught me out on this, I had to go in and convince them all over again that I had disconnected from my mom all over again. And there's no way they really believed me, but I guess they had to at least pretend like they believed me, because I was at least playing along, going along with the show, putting on a good show for them. They were probably like, bravo, sir, we see what you're doing, and we're going to play along for now, is probably what was going on the other end. And, but they continued to get reports from my nanny and from some of my closest friends that of various comments and pieces of evidence that seemed to indicate that me and my daughters were still in touch with my mother. And eventually that, combined with the fact that they were pretty sure I was secretly commenting on some of these blogs, and they were pretty sure they knew who I was, they were like, this dude's just going to keep lying to us, isn't he? And they're like, yeah, he's obviously just going to keep lying to us. We've got no choice but to kick him out. So they kicked me out. And again, this is the short version, because they had to maneuver some things with my boss, who was a very well-known Scientologist. So they kicked me out. And then they go to my wife and they say, you've got to divorce your husband. You know the rules. You got to divorce your husband or you're going to get kicked out. And she's like, that doesn't even make any sense, like mathematically. Mathematically might be the wrong word. But she's like, what? So what? That's not even going to work. Like, if I divorce him right now and disconnect from him, he obviously is still going to have shared custody of our children. Going to think just because Scientology says he's bad. And they're not going to think he's bad just because I'm forced to divorce him. So we're going to share custody until they're 18 anyway. And then when they turn 18, they're not Scientologists. We haven't raised them as Scientologists. And obviously, if you're kicking him out and you make me divorce him, he's obviously not going to let them be raised as Scientologists. So then once they turn 18, what are you going to tell me? They're not going to disconnect from their father, because they won't be Scientologists. And so then I'll have to disconnect from my daughters? So you're going to tell me, so I have to disconnect from my husband now, and then disconnect from my daughters in like 15 years. And that just doesn't work for me. And so they go, all right, you're out. Now, again, that's the short version of the story, because they had to orchestrate how to get me laid off from my job for the Scientologist I was working for, how to get Heather laid off from her job for the Scientologist she was working for, and how to get our kids kicked out of the Scientology school they were going to. And they had to put enough time between these things to make it less likely that we would have a successful religious discrimination lawsuit against either my employer or Heather's employer or the school that the girls were going to. And so, so then they kick her out. And so I'm out, Heather's out. The kids have never been in Scientology, but they were going to a Scientology school. Now, in these Scientology schools, they don't actually really teach Scientology, but it's just a way to keep them out of the public school system because Scientologists are terrified of the public school system. Okay, but so then, and this is where Scientology truly destroys families. So then they go to my wife's parents, who have 2 other daughters and a son, who are also all have spouses and kids, almost all of whom are in Scientology. And then the in-laws' parents are also in Scientology. And so then they go to her parents and they say, you have to completely disconnect from, never again see or speak to your oldest child, your daughter, your eldest, and your 3 beautiful granddaughters. You have to never see them again, or you're kicked out of Scientology. This is where things just get vicious and disgusting and horrible. This is the famous Sophie's Choice. Because at this point, if her parents stand on principle and say, no one's going to tell us that we have to disconnect from our own kids and grandkids, then they lose 3 other grandkids. They lose 3 other kids and a number of grandkids. So even if they stand on principle, they lose much, much more, familially speaking, than if they cave to the family destroying pressure of the cult and disconnect from their daughter and granddaughters. And so as much as I hate her parents for disconnecting from our kids, it's hard to hate them that much because it's not really their fault that they're in a cult. Well, okay, it is their fault that they're in a cult because they joined it. But it's not really their fault that they ended up in a situation where there were only bad choices. And unless I'm being selfish, I have to be willing to recognize that the bad choice they made was still the better choice of the 2 bad choices. If you're just looking at it in terms of, I'd like to keep as many of my kids and grandkids as possible. And I know you can make an argument, the argument could be made that, you know, the best choice is always to stand on principle. And those sound like great words. They sound very virtuous and admirable words, and it's easy to say. But it's much harder to do. And, you know, perhaps an argument could be made that if they had stood on principle and left Scientology and said, we're not accepting your ultimatum, that maybe their other kids would have followed suit, and maybe their other kids' spouses would have followed suit. But you just never know. You just never know if that's actually true. And guys, it's starting to rain really hard, and even though I'm paying attention to the road, and even though this car is driving itself, I feel like I should probably jump just in the name of safety and responsibility. So I know it's only been a 14-minute video, but it's pouring and I'm going to end the video. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. I'll talk to you soon.